Welcome to Inside Housing Vermont, where we talk real estate, consumer education, and the policy shaping housing. I'm your host, Rennick. Here we go. Lieutenant Governor, welcome to Inside Housing Vermont. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited about today.
Great to be here and ready to talk about housing.
Yeah, we got a lot to get to. So before we do that, for anybody, new listeners, why don't you tell me a little bit? I know you're from the Northeast Kingdom. I believe you live on your family's farm up there.
Yep.
You know, who is Lieutenant John Rodgers?
Sure. So I grew up on a farm that's been in my family since 1838. I live in the house that my ancestors built in 1840. It's an old farmhouse. When I was growing up there, it was an 11-bedroom farmhouse. Had the blessing of growing up with my grandmother and grandfather in that house much of the time. So 3 generations of us in the same house, which you don't think much of at the time. But looking back on it, I was so blessed to be able to spend that much time with my grandparents. Grew up in dairy, and we didn't have a lot of money. We worked hard. We ate good because we raised all our own food, taught the respect of the land and how to take care of animals, how to take care of the land. We cut all our own wood for heating the house. We grew most of our own food, big gardens, a lot of freezing, a lot of canning. So really learned how to survive, be independent, right? And grow high quality food, something that it's great to see that we're actually going back to now. All these folks that didn't know about Vermont's history or rural Americans' history thought it was new, but it's not, right? It's new now, but it's replacing what was old. So my grandmother started taking farm vacationers back in the early 60s. So a very cool story. One of my grandfather's best friends lived in Connecticut, and they often came up and stayed with them. And because we had the 11-bedroom farmhouse, it was always full of people, right? And Carl said to my grandmother, Ruth, you cannot keep doing this for nothing. You have to start charging people. And that's what started the agritourism business. And I grew up in a house full of people that came from all over the Northeast, mostly New England, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, but a fair number from Canada, fair number from around the rest of the U.S., and occasionally some from out of the country. So I got a window into the rest of the world, even though we never left the farm that much. So it was a kind of a cool way to grow up. So when I was in high school, I used to get up early in the morning and go do chores and then go get your shower, get cleaned up, dressed up, head off to school, came back, worked weekends. So I was literally putting in probably between 20 and 30 hours of work as a high school kid. Went away to a 2-year technical college and came back and did some odd jobs for a little bit. Wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but loved building things. Started doing some construction work and then started apprenticing for a bricklayer. And soon after that, started my own business in my early 20s doing masonry. The guy was an excellent worker, had a heart of gold, very skilled, very smart, but he was an alcoholic. And so soon after I started apprenticing for him, he didn't want to deal with the estimates. He didn't want to deal with the billing. He just wanted to show up and work. So it taught me a few things. Number one, it taught me how to try to support someone with serious substance use issues, right? So I tried to keep him sober and keep him fed and all that stuff. And actually he had to kind of be his financial manager too, because he would often blow through all his money. And the next week I would have to start loaning him money to get through the week. But it gave me the opportunity to mature quickly and take over running the business.
This was in your early 20s.
This is in my early 20s. Yep. And then a few years later, he took off on this epic trip. He always said when his boys left home, he was going to cross the country with his horse and buggy. Had an old Canadian chunk stallion and a dog and him, and they took off. Took him a few years, went to the Pacific Ocean. So at that point, I was on my own, and the business really took off. I advertised for a couple of years, but really in nearly 40 years in business, have hardly ever advertised and have had most of my jobs are 10, 15, 20 minutes away from the farm. And I slowly transitioned from brickwork into stonework and excavation, which is pretty much all I do now is dry laid stonework, a lot of historic restoration under old post and beam barns. I've just completed the restoration of the stone foundation under the Bread and Puppet Museum in Glover, world famous bread and puppet. I saved the Circus Smirkus barn in Greensboro, done a ton of work at the Old Stone House Museum in Brownington. So I've worked on some really cool old buildings and helped preserve them for generations to come. And that is some of my favorite work, is the historic restoration.
It's also the local piece, right? It's a very locally run business where you're just supporting people on the ground and giving back. And I've seen that about Vermont, that Vermont really likes, when possible, to be local.
And I've had a lot of my friends that were in the same business say, oh, you should travel to Stowe, you should travel to Woodstock, you should travel to Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. And it's like, no, I live here because I love it here. And I am so blessed that the majority of my work is less than a half hour from my house. So I'm working for my friends and neighbors and meeting new people who live in that area. And, the other thing that it allows me to do is there's a lot of folks, especially back when I was doing chimneys, that didn't have a lot of money but needed something. And so I could cut those guys a break. Even though I didn't have a lot of money, I don't have to charge you full fare. Hopefully on the next job for somebody else that I have a bigger job, I'll make that up. But, it's about propping up your community and
paying
helping.
Forward.
Absolutely. Every time. Yep.
So you do that, right? Grow up on the farm. And then at some point you get into the legislature, right? I believe you have 16 years in the legislature.
So my parents and grandparents taught me to give back, right, to the community, to be involved civically. So I started going to town meetings as a young man, always tried to vote and involved in my community. And the collector of delinquent taxes had let things get way behind. And so the first day you go delinquent on property taxes, you get an 8% and a 1% interest charge. So it's devastating for people who are already behind, right? And so some of these folks were back 4 or 5 years delinquent. So they were paying a massive amount in interest and penalties. So I got elected. That was my first elected position, not a highly sought after job.
I would imagine it's not.
Not a lot of thank you notes. But what I did was created policies and worked with people to get them on payment plans, because I knew if they hadn't paid last year's taxes, they were going to incur that penalty again, right? Okay. They were going to get hit with that again. And so I got it all brought up to current. And here's an interesting story that not a lot of people know, but my sister and her wife were floating down the river on inner tubes with Matt Dunn, who I'm not sure if Matt was in the House or the Senate at that point. I think he was a senator. And he said to my sister, we need to find some good candidates from up in the Northeast Kingdom. And my sister said, here's my brother's number. Call my brother. So Matt called me, went down to the State House, met with Michael Obahowski and John Tracy. Michael was the speaker at that time. John was the majority leader. And it was something I always considered doing, but thought I would do it later in life, right? I still had a fairly young business. I had young kids, a lot going on, but they convinced me that there's no time like the present. And so I ran that first time, lost by just a handful of votes, ran the second time, won, did 8 years in the House of Representatives, took a couple years off, ran for the Senate, served 8 years in the Senate, took 4 years off, and I served that whole time as a Democrat. When 23 and 24 hit, there were some very concerning things happening. So I actually went to the State House with some of my friends, and we set up a couple of rallies and press conferences to draw attention to some of the harmful legislation that was going forward. And that's really what pulled me back into politics. In 2023, education property taxes went up 14%. We have the highest cost of health care insurance in the country. We have one of the highest per pupil spending costs in the country. We're the third highest overall taxed in the country. And a new report just came out that says we are the very bottom of the list in economic opportunity.
Yeah. So I've had Kevin Chu on, and he's brought a lot of this data forward. And when you look at it, especially economic outlook, no one wants to be last.
Devastating. Devastating. We had the largest number of population loss per capita of any state. And then they passed Act 181, which for rural Vermonters is absolutely devastating. When we talk about the need for more houses and development, the way many rural people do it is when their children become adults, they don't have a lot of money. Their equity is in their property. They are able to cut off a piece of land and help their kids get started. I just did it with my son. He just built a house a couple years ago. We gave him a piece of land. I do excavation, so we were able to do all that. His father-in-law is a carpenter. He helped him all he could. They still have over $600,000 in that house. So when we talk about affordable housing, it is extremely hard to build anything affordably today.
One of the main questions that I had was, what is affordable housing? Because there's different definitions out there. And some can consider it subsidized homes. Some can consider it just the ability to buy a single family home. So when you look at an affordable house, what is your definition of that?
My first definition as a rural Vermonter would be to be able to afford a little house on a piece of property where you can have a garden and be connected to nature, maybe raise some animals. That's what rural Vermonters want. That's what most people that I know in my community want. They want to feel independent and connected to nature. So what that means is maybe a small cabin or a little ranch house. It doesn't have to be huge. But one of the problems we have in Vermont is, like, when I go to a construction site, the majority of the workers are my age, not your age, not my kids' age, right? So we've missed a whole generation of kids, and our schools and our guidance counselors have tried to convince everybody that they have to go to a 4-year college, which is great. If you want to be a doctor, you want to be an engineer, you want to be something that needs a 4-year degree, that's fine. But not everybody's cut out for that, and not everybody needs to do that. I know electricians that are making between $100,000 and $200,000 a year with nothing but a pickup and hand tools, right? You can make an extremely good living in the trades. I know other tradespeople that started out small and grew into huge multi-million-dollar businesses. So the sky is the limit in the trades. There's massive opportunity. But one of the problems with affordable housing is, with a shortage of contractors, those contractors are mostly picking to build multi-million-dollar houses because that's where they can make more money.
So if we're kind of getting right to the affordable housing piece, there's a few different elements. You have the contractors, the people working on it. You have who's taking the bids. Which one do you think is the overarching cost driver?
One of the overarching cost drivers is something that we can't do much about because, unfortunately, we have allowed a ton of our sawmills to go out of business. We did not support the forest products industry like we should have as a state. We grow a lot of beautiful timber here. Years ago, when I built my first house, we could go to the sawmill in West Burke and buy structural lumber by the cube. We had our house framed up and all covered with plywood with about $2,500 in material. That's a 28 by 36 two-story. Think about that. $2,500. You can hardly build a closet for $2,500 today. So now all our lumber goes to Canada, gets manufactured, comes back value added. So the cost of material is a problem. Permitting is an issue.
That's a huge issue.
In my office, I do a ton of constituent work. So I get calls from Vermonters all the time. And I have a whole bunch of people dealing with wetlands issues, but the one that stands out the most, this young family, their folks gave them a piece of land. They hired an engineer, got their septic design, all municipal permits, everything's in order, send it to Department of Environmental Conservation, it gets approved. They build their septic system, build their house, move in, and then all of a sudden, Somebody from DEC shows up and says, oh, you're built in a wetland.
So DEC?
Department of Environmental Conservation. It's
Gotcha.
a department under our Agency of Natural Resources. This is what's really shocking. The family told me, husband, wife, and their small children are standing there, and this person who works for the state of Vermont told him, if I wanted to, I can make you tear that house down. Now, from my perspective, that's abuse. That is somebody paid with public dollars who is supposed to be serving Vermonters, and I find that totally unacceptable. But he said, okay, what can we do to appeal it? She said, you can hire a consultant. Hires a consultant, and I looked at this guy's resume, extensive education, years in service. This guy probably had more knowledge than anybody who's working in that department. Cost those kids $8,000 for the consultation and the report. Send it to the department. They said, we don't agree with your consultant. Consultant says not a wetland. They say we don't agree. So they just wasted another $8,000. They're incurring lawyers' costs. And the department says, we're going to give you a $60,000 after the fact permit because it's in a wetland that the consultant said it's not a wetland. And so when everything is that unpredictable, you can't have affordable housing because we have a department that can come back on you 5 years, 10 years after you've built the house.
So this comes up a lot, right? I see it all the time when people are trying to develop, especially on their own property, especially more in rural Vermont, which is that balance between environmental permitting and then the ability to use it the way you want. So like, how does that get fixed, right? Because I've seen like having environmental protections in place, most people do.
Yep.
But like, where's the line between being able to use the land? You know, like, how do you draw that up?
Yeah, well, and that is exactly what we need to do. I believe the legislature needs to rewrite wetlands statute and make sure it is interpreted as intended. I believe right now the people that are implementing it are going beyond legislative intent and beyond statute. So I have a 379-acre farm. I set a huge amount of it aside for grassland birds because they're in decline because of modern agriculture. So I have bobolinks and woodcocks and field sparrows and kestrels and all kinds of birds that are in decline. I plant tons of acres of food plots that are specifically designed for wildlife, for birds and pollinators. My land is healthy. I was telling Kian this morning, when I walk up by one of my food plots that's got oats and sunflowers and turnips in it, the oats are now ready. Literally hundreds of birds are flying out of that while I'm walking by, right? So I'm an environmentalist. I do a massive amount with my own money for the environment. And I don't want any valuable wetlands to ever be damaged. But a wet spot in a field is not a wetland. And it is super easy to drain a wet spot in a field so that we can build a house there. And that's where we have to draw the line. We have to set aside what is valuable wetland, what is necessary to protect the environment, and we make a map and we delineate those so that people don't go in blind. Because what I'm hearing over and over is these folks are getting fined for wetlands violations and it's not on a map. It's not delineated. And in your business, you must work with engineers, right?
Happens all the time.
No engineer is going to put a stamp on a septic system if he believes it's a wetland. Their license depends on it. These guys know their soils, and if an engineer comes in and designs a system and puts his stamp on it, you can bet that's not a real wetland.
So basically reconsidering what is considered wetlands
Exactly.
and starting over a little bit.
Starting over. Make sure it's clear and make sure the agency is doing the on-the-ground surveying to make sure that their maps are correct and that we are open for housing in appropriate areas and that we're not taking it all off the map and calling everything a wetland.
So with that, going back to like affordable housing, I think one of the data that came out, and I'm just citing the Vermont's Futures Project, was if we have a growth mindset and we're trying to grow in Vermont, we need somewhere between 24,000 and 36,000 homes before 2029. How do we get there? How do we get there in a way that's giving the mix of kind of homes that Vermonters are after? Or what have you seen that Vermonters are asking for kind of homes?
Yeah, so my perspective is I think we have to be really careful how much we grow and where we grow. So one of the things that Act 181 did is made it much harder or impossible to grow in rural communities, even though some of those rural communities had an industrial base and a much larger population than they do today back in the 1800s and 1900s, right? But if we're going to address the housing crisis, we have to build the right kind of homes. And from my perspective, that means affordable homes that young families can get into and start building equity, and that older people can downsize into. Because one of the things that helps the housing crisis is if older people have an affordable place to scale down in, then families can move into that house. As you know, we have a lot of older housing in Vermont, and I think part of the solution is upgrading that older housing because lifestyles have changed. Like me, I grew up with 3 generations in my house. Now there's just my wife and I. So those kind of houses can be broken up into duplexes. That negates the need for new infrastructure, for septic, for water, for power, all that's already there. So I think there's a massive potential in utilizing the houses we already have on the ground better.
So just hold on there.
Yes.
So why did 181 make it harder? I have a lot of conversations with people, and not everybody is in depth in following 250 and 181. So why did 181 make it harder for what you're talking about?
Basically, most places in Vermont under Act 181 would have to go through Act 250, even for residential housing. Act 250 was never made for residential housing. It was also taking a lot of land that people bought, believing it was developable, and have been paying high taxes on, highest and best use. It was being taxed as developable. And under the maps of 181, much of that land was zoned no development at all. And the land that could be developed, much of it was going to have to go through Act 250. Act 250 adds a massive amount of cost to any project. And so now we're trying to build affordable homes. And now on the average home, we're going to add $50, $100, $150,000 to the cost of that. And when I throw those numbers out, the proponents are going, oh, no, it's not going to cost that much. But they never put out estimate of the actual cost. And so tons of people have done those estimates. What we know is it is going to add a significant amount of cost.
So why do we do it then?
It was a bad idea. And I went down as a citizen, a non-elected official, and helped put together 2 rallies and press conferences to push back against it. No, it was a terrible idea. And I think it woke up a lot of Vermonters who have not been paying attention to what's happening in Montpelier. And let's face it, a lot of Vermonters are working so hard to try to make ends meet. They don't have time to get home and read legislation and watch Zoom meetings, right? It's just the fact of life. Having lived that life, I know what it feels like to get home after an 8 or 10 hour work, lifting stones and doing hard physical labor, and jump in the shower and get cleaned up and dressed up and go to a meeting. It's not what anybody wants to do if the world was perfect, right? You want to sit down and relax with your family at the end of that day. And so I think when those maps finally came out and everybody looked at the maps and went, holy cow, my land is on that map. I can't do anything with my land. It got people riled up. And thank goodness they are now taking note. They're now participating in those planning meetings. And I think it is essential that every Vermonter is paying attention to what their legislators are doing and what is happening in Montpelier, because it does affect them.
So I think it was 325.
325, yes.
325 rolled back some of the plan changes
Yes.
with 181. And so I know there was a rural Vermont movement that happened.
Yep.
So that seemed like, for that constituency,
Positive movement in the right direction, I would say.
What more needs to be done, though?
There are some regional development corporations that are still moving forward with some very, very restrictive plans. So I think that is going to need to be dialed back. One of my concerns, though I agree with the premise of removing redundant regulation. So what Act 181 did in the more urban areas, your downtowns and village centers, is if you had appropriate municipal oversight, you didn't have to go through Act 250 because they were redundant. So costly and redundant. But what's happening in some of our municipalities is we're still having sewer overflows. We're dumping raw sewage into our lakes and waterways. Now, we're supposed to be an environmentally friendly state. We should be doing something to deal with that problem. It's unacceptable. And so from my perspective, you shouldn't be doing a massive amount of new development in a community that's dumping raw sewage into the waterway, right? It's only going to exacerbate the problem. We have to make sure that our public works are working properly before we add more load.
And so one of the follow-up to that is, do you think that doing that, revitalizing some of the stock that we have, being able to get some of the older Vermonters who want to maybe downsize and some of the newer ones into those new homes, do you think that's going to bring enough growth? And do you think that there's a certain amount that Vermont can grow to that is going to help? Because the cost, like we hear it a lot, Vermont's unaffordable, people are leaving, homes are costing too much, and there seems to be various kind of answers as to what's going to do that. Is it reduce the expense size? How do you kind of look at that with, okay, well, we know permitting, we know being able to develop in other areas is important, but what are the other things that we can do?
I think there's a lot to it. I have always been skeptical of building a society on permanent growth, right? It's like a pyramid scheme. At some point, the pyramid collapses. So I think we have to be careful if we look for growth to be the answer to every question. I think we need to grow, but we need to make sure we're doing it sustainably. One of the things that we desperately need to turn Vermont around is to change our demographics. We're the second oldest state in the country. We need more of our young people to stay here. They are the ones that are going to be doing the jobs and paying the taxes. So what do we do to get our kids to stay here? One is reduce the cost of living. Two is make sure they have the training and education to make enough income to stay here and live the American dream. And that's why I'm so focused on the trades. But number three, and something we've done a terrible job with as a state in Act 250 is partly to blame, is bring more high quality manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, and that type of, was just speaking with some folks down to Omnia in Rutland. They wanted to expand, invest tens of millions of dollars in the state of Vermont and provide more good paying jobs. So back to wetlands. They went out back of their facility where they wanted to expand, and years before, somebody had dug a bunch of test holes and not filled them back in. Well, those test holes held some water, started growing a few cattails and other swamp plants. Said, nope, this is a wetland. You can't expand here. It was not a wetland. Man-made pockets holding water. They went and invested millions of dollars in Alabama, and they're now providing jobs in Alabama. Those jobs could have and should have been right here. And I hear it from businesses all the time that say, we won't even look at developing in Vermont because of Act 250. And so here's what we need to do to Act 250. It's simple. Has to be predictable, timely, affordable. Nobody is going to want to invest money in something that may not pay them back for 10 years because it's tied up in court.
How do we do that then?
I think it's pretty simple. Tons of other states do it. Tons of other states get to their permitting way faster. We have to change the appeals process. We have to get to a yes or a no in a timely fashion. I'm not saying we approve everything, right? If it's bad for Vermont, we say no, but we need to say no in 3 months, not 10 years.
Time is money, and also speed is a tactic, right? And if you're building and if you're developing, this happens all the time in our industry, right? You get a quote for something in March and you say, okay, we'll do it in June, and then it doesn't happen till September. And in that time, the costs have risen, right? And so
Exactly.
you're playing catch up. So I can see how if you made a predictable, timely process, that would be a huge amount of cost savings.
Cost savings and predictability for planning. I've heard business owners say that they wanted to do it here, got jammed up, went to New Hampshire, had their permits within a few weeks. So there are other systems that are working better. Look, Act 250 has done some good work over time, right? We don't want bad development. We don't want sprawl. We don't want environmental degradation. But we have to get to a point where we can say yes or no in a timely fashion.
So as you look at that line between environmental and building, going into the next session, does that need to be a priority?
I think so. I think the first thing the Agency of Natural Resources needs to do is delineate the high value wetlands and get them mapped out so that landowners and developers and prospective buyers know exactly where those are. I was just talking with an engineer, and the other guy was a wetlands delineator, and they were sharing some of the cases right now that they were having trouble with, and they're fit to be tied. And a lot of people in those businesses are afraid to speak up and call out that the system is broken because their job, their life depends on it, right? It depends on those people in that agency giving them permits to do their next project. But they were telling me horror stories. This family just came up, they bought like a 60-acre piece and wanted to build a house. There was an existing logging road there from many years. It's been logged off, so the infrastructure was built. There's many wetlands on it, but there's also areas of dry. They said no problem designing a septic system, plenty of room to do everything environmentally friendly. DEC told them it was a non-starter. Nope, you're not building anything here. So we had somebody come here with the hope of building a house and creating a life. And now they're told that they paid market value for a piece of property that is worthless. Now, if it truly is undevelopable, who can they sell it to? Nobody's going to buy it. And are they going to get their taxes reduced? No. They're going to still have to pay excessively high property taxes on a piece of land that's worthless. But the problem is it isn't worthless. It is only worthless because our state agency is not interpreting the law correctly. It is taking land that should be developable and saying that it's not.
So another question that I wanted to bring up, site deviation, but it ties directly into housing. This is something that I know the VAR has been advocating for. There's a lot of various opinions on this, but the second home tax. There's language out there that may be part of the thing that will help housing is if we tax second homes differently. I think we already have that. We have homestead, not homestead. So where do you see that issue in terms of taxing homes, second homes differently?
Yeah, so I guess I would start with the fact that 66% of Vermonters get a rebate. So only 34% of us pay full fare on our property taxes. So as Vermonters, no matter which category you fall into, we at least expect some services, right? But second homeowners aren't using the schools. They're not getting a property tax adjustment. They're paying full fare for very, very little service. So from my perspective, as the state with the third highest overall tax rate in the nation, going to more taxes is the wrong answer. And I don't care which tax it is. Going to more taxes is the wrong answer. I know a ton of people. I have a bunch of friends that have camps or second homes here. They contribute a massive amount of money through taxation and ask for almost nothing in return for services.
I see that too. There's not a lot of huge corporations that own a lot of second homes here. A lot of it is still local.
And in fact, you're right. A lot of it is Vermonters. A Vermonter works their tail off trying to figure out how to make a living so they can stay here. They buy a second property that they rent out for additional income. I know people, we do it ourselves. So we used to be in the bed and breakfast industry, but when COVID hit, we quit and we turned part of our house into a 2-bedroom apartment. For a while, we did short-term rentals there. Additional income to help you pay your taxes. We shouldn't be charging people even more on property taxes that are excessively high if they are trying to make ends meet by having that second income.
One thing we were starting to talk about in the beginning, and I wanted to ask, is you've currently been the lieutenant governor for full term and you're running again. What is your view and take on the lieutenant governorship? I know that technically you're there in case of succession and working with the governor. But beyond that, how do you look at the role? And now that you've had the experience in it, especially during such a tumultuous time, Vermont's made some progress, but there's also been some difficult things. We have an affordability crisis. So how do you look at the office itself and your position in it as it comes to helping people with becoming affordable and housing and all that?
For years, I've thought it's a wonderful platform. And unfortunately, for quite a few years, it has been used as a ceremonial office for people who want to go somewhere else. I ran for this job because I wanted to use this platform. And it is an incredible platform to advocate for Vermonters. And we have literally had several people come into our office at the State House and tell us they have never seen a lieutenant governor's office get so much work done. So during the legislative session, I have a standing meeting with the governor and his leadership team once a week. Can also get hold of him. I work with his team pretty much every day. I work with legislators every day, and I've got an R beside my name, but I work with legislators across all political spectrum. So we're working on legislation, we're working on amendments, we're working on strategies to get stuff done. I've had bills that started and got drafted in my office, and then I get somebody to sponsor them because I can't introduce a bill, but I get a senator to sponsor them and have gotten them through the process signed by the governor. We were made aware by a Vermont athlete that the women's Nordic combined is the only sport that women are not allowed to compete in the Olympics that men are. And so we worked with her to draft a resolution, got it sponsored by 2 senators, passed it through the Senate, passed it through the House, got the governor's signature on it, and sent it to the IOC saying, we, Vermonters, would like you to make gender equality important and make this a women's sport. I am also on the executive board of the National Lieutenant Governors Association, so got it on that agenda. We passed it as a national association, and I asked other lieutenant governors to take it back to their prospective states and try to pass it to put more pressure on the IOC to do it. So really, there are many, many things that you can do and that I do. One of the most important things that I do is constituent work. So we have people call the lieutenant governor's office and say, having trouble getting hold of the tax department, nobody will call me back, or I'm having a wetlands issue. And I call every single person personally that gets hold of the office, talk out their issue with them, and then between myself and my chief of staff, we figure out who we need to get hold of, who we need to connect them to try to help them with their issue. And so we do a massive amount of constituent work.
And how do you think that since you've been in the position, that relationship with the governor, because that was different?
It was way different. And quite frankly, that's one of the disturbing things that my opponent keeps saying is that she had a standing meeting with the governor, and she said in another interview that she met with the governor every couple of weeks. And so I went to the governor's team because I didn't think it was true. And one of the members of the governor's team said, no, that's a lie. We only met with her maybe 4 or 5 times, and it was just to be nice, just to be cordial. It was well known in the media that the governor and Zuckerman didn't ever meet at all. It is absolutely huge to have a lieutenant governor and governor that can work together, that meet and work on the issues, to be able to try to provide a little bit of balance, because the legislature is, both houses are controlled by the Democrats. And from my perspective, we saw how bad things got when the Democrats had a supermajority. And from my perspective, a supermajority of either party is not good. I'm a middle of the road guy. I'm not partisan. I work for Vermonters. I'm a member of a party, but I don't work for a party. I work for Vermonters. And so I want to see that balance. And I think the governor and I provide that balance.
Do you see that balance as a critical issue to sort of dealing with housing? I talk to a number of different people from different parties all the time, and most seem to be aware that affordability in housing is an issue. But something I always wonder is how much of that is getting back to Montpelier. I cite the example of, I had Megan Sullivan on, and she was talking about that the land use committee and the housing committees don't talk. And I was like, I don't understand that. Don't they need to be working together to tackle these issues? So you must see it from your position.
Yeah, I do. And Megan's in our office quite a bit as well. She's awesome. So here's the thing. The governor and I work hand in hand, but the governor and I are different than most people in that building, right? We both grew up in construction. We both had construction businesses. So I've built houses and bridges and septic systems and water systems and drainage systems. The list goes on. And the governor's worked in construction. We understand it. We understand how it works on the ground. We've got legislators that want to make us turn all our diesel trucks into electric trucks to haul gravel. Now, you want to talk about driving the cost of housing up. If you can only haul one load of gravel a day because your battery's flat, they don't understand where the rubber meets the road because they've never seen it and they've never done it. I think that's the most important thing that the governor and I bring to the table is we're pragmatic, we're realistic, we've done the work, we know how to get the work done.
Let's fast forward 5-10 years from now. What does the ideal sort of housing situation look like in Vermont? Like, what have we figured out that we haven't figured out already?
You know, I think some people want to live downtown, right? So we have to make sure that we've got the apartments or condos and the stuff that people want to live in, and that we have enough of the subsidized housing and permanently affordable housing. That's all part of the mix. But the people I know in rural Vermont, that's not what they're interested in. They're interested in a little house where they can be connected to the land. And so I want to make sure that rural Vermont is able to develop as they see fit in appropriate places, that families can continue to help their kids get a start. When we built our first house, I built the house with the help of a whole lot of family and friends. And, you know, we had some subcontractors do some of the stuff, but for the lion's share of it, we built it. And that is the other great thing about teaching kids the trades. Not only can they make a good living, but like me, they can save a massive amount of money by doing a lot of the work on their own house and getting their first house up reasonably compared to just hiring somebody to come in and do the whole thing.
So we're kind of getting near to the end here. Just kind of a switch. What's something about you, John Rodgers, that a lot of people don't know about? Because you've brought a very hardworking, down-to-earth mentality to the office.
I think what I bring to the State House is I've always been that bridge. I was a Democrat. I worked with Republicans. I'm a Republican. I work with Democrats. It's kind of funny because even growing up, there was like the hippie kids and the redneck kids. I got along with both of them, right? I was kind of the bridge even back then. I think being grounded in the community, and, you know, I'm the kind of guy that when there was a tree down across the town road, ran back to the house to grab the chainsaw or a piece of equipment to get the tree out of the road. I still remember one day we got this massive snowstorm and both of my boys were home. And it was so massive that the town had not made it out to our area. A lot of my customers are older people, and some of them had health issues. So we headed out on 3 different machines. One boy on the tractor with a bucket loader. I headed out on the dozer. My other son had the truck with the plow. And we started opening up the town roads to get to our customers, to open them up, so when the town plow finally came through, if something happened, they could get out. And I think it's that community service, it's that community mindedness that Vermont needs more of.
Lieutenant Governor, I appreciate what you're doing. Did I miss anything you wanted to cover?
I think we had a pretty good range there.
No, it was. And I really appreciate you coming and sitting down. Again, this is a local podcast. I'm just here to kind of talk about housing, examine it from sort of as a realtor, as an investor. We see it all the time. And we hate seeing people leave Vermont. We understand, but we also like the new people coming into the state. And it's a beautiful state.
Yeah. Well, and I think the one thing that I would add, we talked about it earlier before we were on air, but the military, having kids in the military, having a lot of family in the military was real important. And we worked hard for a long time to get part of the military benefits exempt from tax. That's something we've got to continue to work on. Fortunate that my kids, who were both in the Navy, just moved back because when they got pregnant with the second child, they decided they needed some family support. But my boy told me a few years ago, he said, "Dad, if our whole foundation of our family wasn't in Vermont, I would never go back." And that is a little bit heartbreaking. And it's because they were just outside of DC, making great money, had a nice little house in a nice little neighborhood. They were probably making more than twice what they're making now. They moved back here. They've got more land, but their cost of living is about the same it was in DC. That's a problem. And I want those military kids that grew up here to be able to come back, but I want all military people to look at Vermont and go, that is the place where I want to have my second career.
There's a lot of talent there.
Yeah.
Somebody who has served and continually do serve. Our base here is known for bringing that Vermonter work ethic to everything we do, and we're trying to do a lot of good things. And so appreciate that support. Sir, thank you so much for coming in. How does anybody get a hold of you, reach you?
Yeah, so we have our website, be the place to go, Rodgers for Vermont, Rodgers, FORVT. And that's probably the best place to get information, and that will connect everything else we have going on.
Appreciate it, sir.
Appreciate the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. That's it for this episode of Inside Housing Vermont. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe and share it with a friend. It really helps our show grow. See you next time.